So if you look at the current situation, and hopefully we'll be able to exit it relatively quickly, do you believe that government's perspectives have changed regarding air transport, given that aviation is absolutely necessary for economic recovery? Michel, I don't know whether you would like to answer. Do you think that there might be an opportunity here to redesign the conversation, the engagement between governments and the industry? Well, this is something that is extremely important, because we might have thought that with the health crisis, the catastrophic situation of air transport today, you might have thought that environmental goals or emissions goals would come at the second level. But we realized that it's absolutely not the case. This is not the way forward. It was confirmed again by airlines in the previous panel. But above all, it's precisely because we are in a very complicated and difficult financial situation, and because government support is necessary, that we need to harness the situation, because airlines and all operators, not just airlines, but also the whole industry, they have less money now than they might have had in the past to work on environmental problems. So governments need to do both at the same time. Help operators recover and improve their situation, and also help them address the climate issue. So this is a very big challenge, and on that front, there are a number of countries that moved forward faster than others, and if you move faster, you can use a number of options, but we need to make sure that all these options are compatible at the global level. You could not have any aviation sector with multiple and different technologies depending on the airport. So, I mean, we need to realize that. This is an industry that's intrinsically international. So we need to have harmonization, or at least interoperability, that is organized. And so I think that in this respect, governments, well, maybe Europe can take the lead, or maybe someone else. ICAO is going to have its general conference in 2022. This is an opportunity maybe to push this item forward, but I think that given the extreme emergency and magnitude of the challenge, we need to adopt initiatives before that. As early as this year, we need to probably think about an international conference that would focus on this matter, so that a debate can take place and decisions and actions can follow immediately within a decade. That's what I took away. Zero carbon. For that, we need to make a decision this decade and not in 10 years' time.
All right. So we've heard just how important this issue is for everyone. We've seen that it was critical not to take steps that might actually be counterproductive, might jeopardize the industry. We said that solutions should be global rather than local. There's always the danger when every government tries to do it its own way, and because you might find yourself in a complicated situation. But in any case, going back to economic policies, and of course, when we are experiencing this unprecedented crisis, the big concern is that the air industry might find itself burdened with new taxation. So, but there are things already in place, ETS and CORSIA. But are there further steps that can be taken? Mr. Gandil. Well, look, UETS and Corsia were set up in well, context rather than different than the present situation. The issue now, as it's being addressed, is should there be a form of sort of a deterrent tax that is something that would be a disincentive for people to travel, and of course that is being considered in a European context. But of course, it's very easy to come up with a tax system that might destroy the air industry, that would have disastrous consequences, both in terms of employment, economic consequence that might be dire in countries that very much depend on tourism. And in any event, that will not in any way help find funds to invest in decarbonation. So I think we should go in a completely different direction. What is very much needed are steps that will be directly effective for decarbonation, and that is what is being considered in Europe with a mandate for FAS, for alternative fuels. Now, of course, that may mean more expensive fuels, so there is a form of taxation, if you like, but this will have a direct effect on carbon emissions. So at least there's a tangible effect right there. Plus, starting or jump-starting this economy of alternative fuels, you would have the beginning of a supply chain, because right now they're not available, at least not on a large scale. So that would be a virtuous cycle, which is very much what airlines need in any case, because many find themselves in dire straits because of the COVID crisis, and many of them are on a sort of a life support, like many other industries, indeed, like a number of countries. And so right there you would have an effective solution. And then should other solutions be found, such as hydrogen or other synthetic fuels, well, again, that would come at a cost, but again, that cost would be quite different from a tax. Now, you could imagine this being scaled up on the European level, or indeed on the global level. But for that to happen, you'd have to go through ICAO and international conferences. But then you would be looking at something of the same magnitude as the Paris Climate Agreement a few years back. But in any case, this is what is needed. What Corsia was attempting to do was to stabilize emission levels, but it's not enough to stabilize them. You have to bring them down. So, of Corsia is a diplomatic success. It is indeed an economic success, an unprecedented economic success, but inevitably we'll have to do more than that. All right. Well, look, this takes us to almost the end of the time we have. Let me move on to another item. Operators believe that they need some form of regulatory support to help develop alternative fuels. Charles, you have a new microphone now? Maybe we can hear you better. Yes, I hope you can. Can you tell us about the role of the World Bank regarding alternative fuels? Well, yes. Biofuels are a significant opportunity for developing countries. On the one hand, But of course, there's well, the farming sector will directly benefit from this. But there's the other sources. You can recycle municipal waste, and there are cities where you can have a scheme whereby the production of biofuels could involve the recycling of domestic waste. Then, of course, the big question is how to build the necessary infrastructure. Investment is needed there, and of course, that is being considered as part of the climate issue. All right, now we cannot hear. Thank you. What is the position of African governments on this matter?
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to just address a few things before I go into the specifically. I want to agree, first of all, with the interventions made by Monsieur Gandil regarding the fact that the attempts at the moment, any attempt at the moment to try to constrain aviation is actually counterproductive to what we can achieve in terms of how we're pursuing our aviation and climate change agenda. So that's the first point to make. Secondly is Laurent's point on CORSIA, well made in terms of CORSIA and market-based measures being, perhaps the last solution. We've had some success with the CORSIA. We have, 88 states who are under that right now. And that calls to mind the necessity, to your point, of SAF really being driven forward. And this is where we come to government support. We simply need the support of government to be able to drive SAF forward. The cost, of course, is something we've talked about. It is prohibitive at the moment. It's almost 2 to 4 times the cost of normal liquid fuel. But we do need to find a way of commercializing and of scaling up, and also incentivizing the airlines to continue to invest in these by not saying airlines for aviation emissions, which is a form of a penalty. And what we find is that imposing a tax doesn't necessarily address the challenge. When you're imposing a tax, it's going to pay for something else and not necessarily to actually achieve a specific decarbonization objective. So just to mention those particular points. Now on SAF, African governments have actually been working quite hard. We have some good examples before the COVID of African airlines and in collaboration with their governments using SAF for commercial flights. We had South African Airways before, they went into business rescue from Solaris, from a tobacco plant, and to as drop-in addition to conventional fuels for flights domestically, and that was already happening. Mango Airlines also had started to do that. Most recently before the COVID-19. Of course, quite a number of countries in Africa, and it would be great to see how big oil can support, a bigger drive towards commercialization of sustainable aviation fuel. So this is a really important topic for us as in the industry and something that we're driving. In addition to this, and I'm sure you heard this earlier from the previous roundtable, the ATAG, the Air Transport Action Group, recently released its report in September with a waypoint 2050, which is a pathway towards getting to our carbon objectives of carbon net, halving our carbon footprint by 2050 to 2005 levels. And one of those pathways is sustainable aviation and new technologies. On sustainable aviation fuels is really critical because in the medium to long term, we see that medium and long haul flights are, which is 75% of commercial aviation, are going to need sustainable aviation fuels in order to be able to really make this target. And that needs the strong support of governments. From the African perspective,
I have to interrupt
yes,
there because we're running
sure.
out of time. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you for the perspective. So, look, what we're hearing here is, again, you know, we heard it in the... pardon, je parle en anglais. Je retourne en français. Ce qu'on a entendu dans le premier...
Thank you. What we just heard in the first roundtable was that it is essential to have a closer cooperation between the various stakeholders if we are to meet that opportunity to and develop SAFs as a sort of a midterm objective. Now, and this should be developed on a global scale. Look, the time has come for the Q&A, and we have questions from our listeners. Can we throw the jingle?
So, alors, bonjour. On a des questions qui sont arrivées. Je vais les poser au panel.
Sorry, we have questions now that have just arrived. How about a carbon budget for international air transport and in Europe or in Africa? Who would be the one to decide on that budget? Well, thank you, Paul. I mean, when you start talking in terms of carbon budgets, a question comes to mind. I mean, when considering these measures, I mean, that look very much like a form of a market mechanism. We still should ask, well, what's the societal value of these industries that are that have to abide by these mechanisms, and looking at well, if the purpose is to reduce the carbon footprint, that may not be the best way to address this. The other question about carbon budget is that you have to say, well, what industries really are in a position to reduce their carbon footprint in the short term. I don't believe it. I mean, we shouldn't just decide now on a carbon budget 30 years down the road when certain industries are in a position to reduce their carbon footprints much faster than the air industry. So intuitively, I would say that is probably not the best way about this. I mean, we could consider carbon budgets, but they have to take into account the specific circumstances, the societal value of these industries, and the ability for various industries to reduce their carbon footprint on a more or less short term. Thank you. Another question. The emergence of low-cost airlines has brought about an increase in the number of point-to-point connections and indeed more use of air transport. But is that in line with the objectives of climate targets? Well, low-cost airlines did not develop overnight, and you cannot expect an individual company to say, right, I will or will not be compatible with climate objectives, and so therefore I will or will not pursue this line of business. I mean, you have circumstances, you have backgrounds, and then you have companies operating in these circumstances. Now, low-cost airlines offer very cheap airfares. Some of them are almost nil, and of course, they do not reflect economic reality. I mean, these are loss leaders. They do not reflect the actual business model or economic reality, and that in itself should be addressed. Now, trying to cut down on short-haul airlines when there are train alternatives is all very well, but that's not really the purpose of low-cost airlines that will fit what windows of opportunities are available. Now, there may be shortcomings in the system, but it is true that low-cost airlines have provided forms of connectivity that were not around before, precisely at the time when Europe was trying to reconnect, and that was useful for students, but also for tourists. And when you have people who 50 years ago went to war in an attempt to destroy one another, when now they go visit one another, and that's certainly a positive development. So once again, the idea is not so much to stop people from traveling or traveling by air. The idea is to cut down on harmful emissions. Now, if you want to do this, this will come at the cost. This will make transportation more expensive. This will have consequences for low-cost airlines, but if the consequences will be economic, will be environmental, but this is not to say that some sort of a dictatorial approach should be put in place. All right, there's another question about compatibility between deregulation and the climate challenge. Should it not be necessary to have, in fact, more regulation? But if so, what kind of regulation should be introduced? Michel Waschenheim. Well, I can certainly take that question. On the one hand, well, in other words, you're saying, well, liberalization means an opening up of the air industry, and some people might decide to climb down from a liberal context and or sort of a free market context, more to the point. And of course, we shouldn't climb down from an open market, and we shouldn't decide to start regulating capacity prices and whatnot. But there should be such a thing as environmental regulation. And what we find is that there are growing differences between states. And again, in the context of international air transport, you cannot imagine a world where rules might apply, say, to airlines from country A, while other rules apply to an airline from another country, from country B, when these two lines compete with one another, because there is competition. So of course, the issue of regulation should be considered on that front. What is needed here is international consultation. Now, there could be talks at ICAO level, and talks might consider environmental or other forms of regulation, but right now, you have to remember that for airlines, you have a system of bilateral treaties, and it is for states to decide, and states are sovereign. So at this stage, if you want to have multilateral rules, of course, they have to be compatible with market mechanisms.
Thank you very much. I hope the connection is working, but perhaps you could tell us your own perspective, Adefunke Adeyemi, on this deregulation aspect.
Okay, I think that there's a need for regulation at the right level and for the right issues. For example, CORSIA. CORSIA needs to be implemented at state level, at national level. And so this is something that requires a concerted effort to instill the adoption of this global measure into a national legislation. There are other examples, perhaps, where overregulation could be a challenge. For example, regulating taxation, as we've talked about already, would be a challenge towards achieving the climate objective, in our view. So that's another example. where regulation promotes the right kind of balance in terms of sustaining or promoting the growth of the industry, that can be rightly supported, especially if it's done in consultation with industry to ensure that it is the right kind of regulation, smart in the sense of the OECD fashion. And I'm sure Laurent knows what I'm talking about here. So this is really important, that regulation should be at the right level on the right issues, especially on the climate challenge. We're still trying right now as an industry to figure out a pathway towards longer term goals in terms of the immediacy of looking at the climate issues. The industry, I think, is doing okay in the terms of its targets that it has set and its journey so far. When you look at the technology, when you look at the infrastructure, when you look at the operations, and you look at a combination of all of these elements, the industry is self-regulating, if you like, in terms of how to achieve all of these issues. And under ICAO, as was said already by our former representative, ICAO has a lot of standards which the states are implementing and working towards to achieve many of these issues. So I think the general message here is, regulate for the right reasons, for the right purpose, in consultation with industry. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Merci, Frankie. Alors, j'ai plusieurs questions à très peu
Thank
de
you very
temps.
much. I have a number of questions and not very much time. So there's a question here. Let me see.
Avec des réponses très courtes.
I will ask you for very, very brief answers. Should we, can we change the annexes to the Chicago Convention to make ICAO more effective in environmental terms? How can we improve the way ICAO works so that it becomes more responsive? Is it possible to have a very brief answer to that question? Well, we could just say yes, couldn't we? But not when it comes to the annexes, which, are regulation. They can be amended, of course, but that would be a challenge in and of itself. It would be quite complicated. The convention itself is concerned, and we would have to build the climate change dimension itself into the convention. That's perhaps the briefest answer I could provide. Thank you very much for being so concise. Very helpful. One final question for Mr. Gondil. You were saying that heavy taxing of the air transport industry would be harmful to its climate adaptation efforts. And perhaps we can have some comments also from Mr. Schlumberger on this. But we know that there is this 80% proportion of the price of plane tickets which could derive from SAFs. Well, several things there. We know that, first of all, there are going to be huge investments needed by the industry so that it can cover the costs of more expensive fuels and also quickly purchase new aircraft. And we know that airplanes can be used for a long time. So if, in addition to this, there is excessively heavy-handed taxation, I was talking about taking it out on the sector in that sense, then it's difficult to see how we could strike a balance. It's less of a problem if the taxation concerned is earmarked for specific areas of activity. And it can sometimes be the case that taxation leads to some losses in efficiency, if you look at it in terms of physics, in the operations of various players in the economy, so that you have to perhaps find the right balance between different tools in terms of taxation policy and make sure that all the different sectors, the ones that produce the fuels, the ones that manufacture the airplanes and the ones that fly them, and ultimately the final users, the passengers themselves, can contribute to making it all work in a healthy economy. Well, thank you very much. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of this panel discussion. There are so many intricate issues coming together here, but hopefully we will have been able to touch upon some of the ins and outs of the problems here. I'd like to thank all of our contributors, Patrick Gandil, Michel Vanheim, Laurent Timsit, who are here, Charles Schlumberger and Adefunke Adeyemi. Thank you very much for joining us, respectively, from Nigeria and Switzerland.